Okay, I'm going to kick things off with a very brief introduction, and then we're going to go over to Dr. Callum Webb. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The nature of the webinar is that attendees can't speak, but we are anxious to share with Callum your questions. So if you've got any questions at any point, if you type them into the chat, my role is really to sort of go through those and ask them to Callum. So as we go along, do ask any questions. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Webb. Callum is part of a team that has been doing really, really interesting and important work around inequality and its impact on children's social care in various ways. And in this talk, he's going to be talking about inequality, ethnicity, race issues, and intersectionality. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what he's got to say. If you've got any questions at any point, put them into the chat. So I'd like to hand over to you, Callum. Hopefully you're still there. Brilliant.
I am indeed. Thank you. Sorry, as soon as you share the screen, everything disappears and you can't find how to unmute yourself. I'm going to leave my camera off just while I'm giving the presentation, and then I'll put it back on for Q&A. Thanks, Donald, for the introduction. Thanks so much for inviting me to present on this. As Donald says, I was part of the Child Welfare Inequalities Project, which was a Nuffield Foundation funded study which was looking at structural inequalities in child welfare interventions. So taking a particular focus on socioeconomic factors and looking at how poverty and deprivation was associated with intervention rates. And towards the end of that project, me and a few others from the project, including Jonathan Schofield and Paul Bywaters and Gavin Davidson, looked at an extension study to have a look at or get some kind of a handle on the intersectional inequalities that we'd started to notice coming up through the descriptive statistics over the project. And we wanted to think about ways that we could model those intersectional inequalities and identify differences between different ethnic populations' rates of intervention relative to the level of deprivation their neighbourhood was facing. And that's where this project came out of, and this is what I'm going to be presenting today. And the aim for today is to give a kind of broad overview of what that intersection between ethnicity and deprivation looks like when you're looking at child welfare interventions in England, at least. And we hope there will be a large number of sort of similarities across England and Wales, as there tends to be, but I guess I should preface this by saying that that this was data we were looking at from England and from a representative sample of local authorities in England. So the purpose of this presentation is really to give you a quick overview of socioeconomic and ethnic inequalities in child welfare interventions, but also more broadly what the relationship between ethnicity and poverty is in the UK. And then I'm going to kind of pose the idea that sometimes when you're looking at these more descriptive one-dimensional statistics, it can be quite easy to fall into the trap of conflating the idea of socioeconomic injustice with the idea of racial or ethnic injustice. And that's really the kind of thing that we wanted to explore with this study as well, was looking at, well, if we sort of assume one thing about the relationship between poverty, race and child welfare interventions, could that actually lead to us making some quite poor decisions on how we approach reducing inequalities through policy and practice. And then I'm going to just present one way of thinking about the social gradient, which is a sort of concept that we've used to describe the scale of socioeconomic inequalities in child welfare. And one of our challenges that we faced was, how do you summarize that information in a quick way and in a way that lets you compare it between different groups? And then I'm going to go through what that relationship between ethnicity and the social gradient looks like, but I'm going to focus just on children looked after rates, just for the sake of brevity. We did look in the study at children in need rates and child protection plan rates, and it's quite interesting how things differ depending on what kind of intervention you're looking at. And that's in the paper itself that I'm happy to send to anyone that's interested. And then I'm just going to address a point about how we frame this within the idea of services and systems as opposed to sort of families' exposure to risk and exposure to child abuse, individuals' exposure to child abuse and neglect. And then I will very quickly summarize consequences for policy and practice. I know that sounds like a lot, but hopefully we can go through it. And as I'm sure you guessed from the title and the abstract that went out, some of this is quite complex stuff. There's quite a lot to cover, even in our sort of oversimplified world of simplifying ethnic groups down into the census categories and such. So I don't necessarily expect everyone to sort of take in everything from the presentation, but I hope you'll have access to the slides and you'll get the gist of it, and you'll be able to come back to this as a resource that might be useful when thinking about policy or practice or research that you might be doing. So this is a graph that you might be familiar with, or you might have seen a few times before. And a key finding from the Child Welfare Inequalities Project, that children in the poorest 10% of neighbourhoods in our representative sample of local authorities in England are about 10 times more likely to be living in care than children in the least poor 10% of neighbourhoods, or the most affluent, even though we're not technically supposed to call sort of the first decile of deprivation affluent. And that difference is about 12 times for child protection plans. And it's a bit more for Wales, but also you have so few neighbourhoods in the sort of least deprived decile that, you know, it's not necessarily that it's 100 times in Wales, but both figures are on here, and you can see that there's this steep increase from 9 child protection plans per 10,000 children in the least deprived 10% of neighbourhoods in England, all the way up to about 113 in the most deprived 10%. And you can see also, one of the things that we're at pains to point out is that that this is a sort of continuous gradient. It's not a sort of steep jump. Every increase in deprivation decile is associated with some increase, it seems, in intervention rates. So that's sort of the first part of the picture, that we have these steep socioeconomic gradients in child protection rates, but in interventions more broadly. And the second part of the picture, when we're starting to build the complexity and thinking about ethnicity as well as poverty, is that according to the Social Metrics Commission, there are between 1.7 and 2.4 times higher rates of people living in poverty from Black, Asian, mixed heritage, or other ethnic groups than there are for households that are sort of grouped as white or white British households. So, for instance, you can see people living in the households where the head of household is Black, and that could be African, Caribbean, British, or other. We're about 2.4 times more likely to live in poverty compared to people living in households where the head of household was white. And then the third piece to this picture is looking at looked after rates based on ethnic group, and the sort of data we have at a national level tends to sort of group all of the diverse ethnic groups that you have in the census into meta groupings. But you can see from this that with some similarities to the last slide, mixed heritage children are about 1.55 times more likely to be living in care. Black children are about 1.36 times more likely to be looked after. And then also one of the things that people may be very familiar with, and there's parallels sort of across the world, that Asian children are almost 3 times less likely to be looked after, just going on a sort of population rate basis. And as I said, you also find this with indigenous populations in places like New Zealand, the United States, Canada, and Australia. By that, I mean you tend to find overrepresentation in interventions among indigenous populations. So if we took those 3 pieces of the picture together, we might come to the conclusion that at least some proportion of the overrepresentation of at least Black and mixed heritage children in the child protection system might be associated with the fact that they are much more likely to be in households that are living in poverty. But also, and then we would be using the logic of the fact that there's a high socioeconomic gradient to explain that. So that's sort of the common response that certainly I think that I had. I can't speak for the rest of the team, but certainly a lot of people have that sort of logical deduction when they get those 3 pieces of one-dimensional information and statistics. So sometimes the deduction is sort of that the ethnic inequalities associated with race and racism and socioeconomic inequalities associated with poverty and class are the same thing in the child protection system, in the child welfare system. And therefore, we might be able to tackle these, we might be able to reduce ethnic inequalities by reducing socioeconomic inequalities, and we might also be able to reduce socioeconomic inequalities by reducing ethnic inequalities. That is often a sensible sort of conclusion to those 3 pieces of information. And the purpose of this isn't to sort of completely discount that idea, but it's to say that it's a bit more complicated than that. So those big inequalities and exposure to poverty do clearly play a role, but there are additional things to think about which come across when we look at controlling for poverty in our sort of statistical analysis. So from the descriptive data on part of the study that Paul led, we found that many ethnic groups were actually disproportionately overrepresented on average are actually underrepresented when you're looking at just the high deprivation neighbourhoods, and their overrepresentation is highest when you're looking in the low deprivation neighbourhoods. So when you start looking at those descriptive statistics, it seems to emerge that poverty is only explaining part of the picture, and we didn't really know how much then, I wouldn't say. And one way we could go about finding out how those differences emerge is that we could create lots and lots of different versions of that first graph, the socioeconomic gradient, and we could try and figure out what's going on there and try and compare those, but it's quite a lot of complexity to hold in your head. If you imagine there are sort of 18 ethnic groups in the UK census, or at least in the English part of the UK census, and you would have to have 18 of those different graphs, and also you would have probably some strange outliers or some small sample sizes making things a bit more difficult. It's a little bit tricky to sort of keep all that in your head, let alone do an analysis on it. So in an attempt to explore this question in a bit more detail, we came up with a sort of 1 number way to measure the size of the social gradient, and to test how large or small it was and how different it was between different ethnic populations. And I'll sort of go over this a couple more times before we get to the end of the presentation, so hopefully it makes some sense. So essentially, one of the ways to think about this is imagining the social gradient as a seesaw. So you can think of it as the stronger the social gradient is, The steeper the seesaw is, usually where the left-hand side of it is lower down and the right-hand side of it is higher up. And that's pretty much the same as if we go back to here, if we were to just draw a line through here and use that as a gradient. That's almost what we're doing here when we're coming up with a one number term. So we start to think about the social gradient in terms of this seesaw and how rates increase as deprivation increases. So we've got low deprivation on one side of the seesaw, average in the middle, and high deprivation at the high end. And we can extend this further to sort of very low and very high if we wanted. And then what we're doing is trying to figure out what rate or the extent to which the rates increase as you move from one side of the seesaw to the other. So if we went from low deprivation and followed the social gradient up to average deprivation, and the technical way that we measured this is we looked at standard deviation changes in indices of multiple deprivation score. But if the technical detail is not sort of your forte, it's basically say you increase the amount of people experiencing income deprivation by about 10%. So if there's about 10% more of the population experiencing income deprivation, we would expect about a 1.7 times increase in children looked after rates. So that's the way we get from sort of one bar chart with lots and lots of bars on it to a single number that we can compare between groups. The nice thing about having that single number and calculating it in this way as a literal gradient up a line, anyone who remembers or has done recently their secondary school maths and had to calculate gradients of a straight line on a graph, it's almost exactly what we're doing. But the nice feature about this is as long as the line follows the same trend, we can apply that same increase across all different levels of deprivation. So while it's a 1.7 times increase from low deprivation to average deprivation, we'd also expect on average a 1.7 times increase from average deprivation to high deprivation. And we can even extend that further. So if you're familiar with statistics and standard deviations, that would cover about 66% of neighbourhoods in England from low to high. But we could go all the way up to very high deprivation. And from our calculation of the average gradient, we'd expect another 1.7 times increase. And that's where our research, that's where our extension project research was really doing. It was looking at how the social gradient changes depending on different contexts. So as well as ethnic group, we also looked at and published research about how income inequality was associated with changes in the social gradient. And the findings from that are if you've got a low income inequality local authority, you actually have a much lower social gradient. So there's fewer socioeconomic inequalities. The line is a lot more flat. And it comes out to be about 1.4 times when you're in a low income inequality local authority. And it increases if you're in a high income inequality local authority to, I think, about 2 times. So hopefully that's fairly clear. I'm going to go through an example of differences between a few different ethnic populations, and then I'm going to give you a summary. But really the takeaway from those few slides is just we're trying to compress all of that complex information from the graph with lots of bars into a single digit so that we can compare it much more easily between different populations, with the purpose here being to look specifically at different ethnic group populations. So once we look at just white British populations within sort of small areas called MSOAs, we find that the social gradient is about 3.9, so much, much larger than the social gradient that we calculate for the average population. So you can see it won't be exact, but you can see that between low and middle, you get almost a 3.9 times increase. Between middle and high, you get almost a 3.9 times increase. The reason it's not exact is because it's trying to average out across low and middle and high and very high and very low and low. So that's why it's not perfectly exact with the numbers, but you can hopefully see that the social gradient is really steep for the white British MSOA population. And if you're in a low deprivation MSOA, we would predict that the rates were only about 11 children in care for every 10,000 white British children. But if you're in a high deprivation MSOA, we would estimate that the rates are about 163 white British children in care for every 10,000 white British children. And then we can juxtapose that with rates for other ethnic groups. So for instance, here is the social gradient that we estimate for Black African MSOA child populations. And instead of 3.9 or even 1.7, we actually found that that came out to be about 1.14, which was not statistically significant, which means that it's roughly the same rates of intervention, no matter how high the levels of deprivation are in the neighborhood. So you can see from the graph that if you're in a low deprivation neighborhood, we would expect there to be about 47 Black African children in care for every 10,000 Black African children in care. And that means obviously that you're going to get different rates of over or underrepresentation depending on what kind of neighborhoods you're looking at. So in low deprivation MSOAs, Black African children's care rates outnumber the white British children's care rates by about 4 to 1. So the rates are about 4 times higher. But as soon as you look in the high deprivation areas, the rates flip and there's about 2.7 white British children in care per 10,000 for every 1 Black African child in care from those high deprivation neighborhoods per 10,000 children. And obviously, even though this is lower, the rates are much lower for Black African children in high deprivation neighborhoods. We can't forget that there's still a massive overrepresentation of Black African children living in those neighborhoods. You know, if the rates are about double or whatever it was from the first slide. So this is sort of assuming if we had equal sized populations, but obviously in reality, even if the rates of intervention are lower, you've got far more children living in high deprivation areas who are Black African. So you have to sort of strip away some of the complexity and then put it back and strip it away and put it back to get the idea of this full picture. And this is why we described in the paper the intersection of deprivation and ethnicity or race and class as an intersection that cuts both ways. And we're borrowing that term from a paper by Newitz and Ray, which is talking more about sort of language use and the idea of deconstructing the idea of white trash as an insult in America. So it raises questions about why do the combinations of, say, some ethnic group identity combined with socioeconomic privilege lead to different outcomes? So is there something about how socioeconomic factors are interpreted or how they are sort of, how they play into other systemic processes like referrals or any other kind of things related to policing or schools or education? How do those play into how white British children might come to the attention of the child protection system, and why there's so much lower intervention when you have higher intervention with the Black African population living in similarly affluent neighborhoods? And it's a good point at this point to mention that some of these questions we won't be able to answer or check until we have much better individual level data, because this is assuming that the correspondence between the neighborhood someone's living in and how likely they are to live in poverty or what their socioeconomic circumstances are closely related or equally related across lots of different ethnic groups. But that might not necessarily be the case. People from some ethnic groups might prefer to live in neighborhoods for other reasons not related to socioeconomic circumstances than others. There might be some variation there. But this is just what we get from a sort of population level look with the data that we have available. And there's one more sort of ethnic population I want to go into detail with before I give you a summary that hopefully is helpful and that you can come back to. And that's the category in the census that is rather sort of unhelpfully defined as mixed heritage other. So what's really interesting, or what I find really interesting about this mixed heritage other child population, is that we don't really know who either gets put in that category by services if they have to decide on what ethnic group to classify a child within, or who sort of identifies with that category when they're asked to put their ethnic identity into sort of one of these constrained boxes that the census has. So what tends to happen in a lot of research is the mixed heritage other category specifically ends up discounted a little bit because it's hard to draw many conclusions from it, and it is quite a small category in the grand scheme of things, but it's also the fastest growing ethnic population in the UK. So we often don't know very much about what kind of inequalities they face, but if we're looking at the child protection system, we find some really interesting things, particularly around the fact that they have a very, very strong social gradient. So their social gradient, I think, is not significantly different to the white British one. It's approximately the same. And you can see that in the steepness of the lines. But also they also have a higher average level of intervention across the board, no matter what level of deprivation you're looking at. So I think even if you get to sort of very low deprivation neighborhoods, there still tends to be an overrepresentation of mixed heritage other children in the child protection system. And there might be some demographic factors associated with that, like the fact that people who aren't white British might be younger on average, so they might be more likely to have children of school age. But it's something that we still don't know very much about, but something that should really be on our radar, because there's sort of the double-edged sword of the really strong social gradient and the sort of ethnic disproportionate over intervention that we find among many ethnic groups. And the value of putting those social gradients into those single digits is you can summarize things in a sort of simplistic way as possible for large numbers of different populations in a table like this one. And there's not really time to run through all of these, and I'm sure there'll be some interesting questions, or people might want to go away and think about them and reflecting on their own experiences. But you can see that the social gradient differs quite strongly, not just between sort of larger ethnic groups of white, Asian, Black, mixed heritage, but also within those sort of larger ethnic categories that we tend to sort of conflate quite uncritically in a lot of studies, sometimes out of necessity, but sometimes because it's common practice. So you can see, for instance, Asian Pakistani child population does have a significant social gradient that's quite large. You know, moving from low to average deprivation is about a 2.2 times increase in children looked after rates. But you don't get the same for the Bangladeshi or the Indian child populations. And that has consequences for what disproportionality looks like depending on how deprived an area is. So yeah, again, I can't go through all of these, but some of them are worth noting. But there's a lot of variation that means that our simplistic explanation that a lot of ethnic inequalities can be explained by poverty doesn't really hold up. If that held up, these would all be approximately the same. You know, if the two things could be considered part and parcel of one whole picture, then the social gradient measure would be the same. And we can take these social gradients and sort of get a picture of of what average levels of overrepresentation or underrepresentation might look like, depending on what level of deprivation there is in the neighborhood for the populations we're looking at. So you can see in the vast majority of low deprivation MSOAs, there's actually there's actually overrepresentation for most ethnic groups than there is for the white British population. So if these numbers are over 1, it means there's a higher rate ratio. So for instance, for every 1 child per 10,000 that is looked after in low deprivation neighborhoods that's white British, you would expect to see about 2.3 children who are Asian Bangladeshi who are looked after per 10,000 of the Asian Bangladeshi child population, and about four Black African children looked after for about every 10,000 Black African child population. And then you can see in high deprivation areas, it actually sort of switches for a lot of groups, not all of them. For the mixed heritage other group, we'd still expect that disproportionate overrepresentation. But for many groups, it's lower, but also quite different between different groups. So you can see here for Black Caribbean child population, it's actually very close to white British rates of intervention compared to Black African and Black other child population. So there's a lot of information there, and quite a lot of complexity. But I think the consequence of not trying to get to grips with that complexity is possibly misrepresenting what ethnic inequalities look like in the child protection system, and possibly having difficulties sort of making strategic decisions about how to reduce those inequalities. I've put this slide in here, but I don't really think there's a huge amount of time to go through it. But this is essentially one way of visualizing all of those things at once. And each of these squares represents sort of one child looked after, and this is an imaginary neighborhood where there's an equal sized population of every ethnic group. And it shows what the numbers of children looked after would look like if there were equal sized populations in every neighborhood, but the only thing that was changing was low, average, or high deprivation. If the rates were equal, we'd expect the same number of children looked after from every ethnic group. But what actually happens is this sort of messy picture to the right hand side, where you get overrepresentation for almost every ethnic group in the low deprivation neighborhoods, and underrepresentation for a few, but not all, in the high deprivation neighborhoods. So it's kind of a similar way of talking about this picture here, but some people might find that one more useful. Some people might find the table more useful. And the last thing to talk about is something that it's very hard to sort of evidence, but something that should be addressed in terms of childhood exposure to child abuse and neglect, and what kind of statistics we might have that talk about that. Because one of the conclusions that I don't want people to make out of this is sort of that some ethnic populations are more predisposed to child abuse and neglect even after you control for poverty. That's what I don't want to happen. So I think it's worth looking at what is in the data from the crime survey for England and Wales that's conducted by the Office of National Statistics, that collects some data about adults reporting abuses, so reporting that they experienced abuse when they were children. So I've put the percentages here, and they don't give sort of detailed breakdowns of ethnic group, and also we can't really control it for the effect of poverty because we don't know what their parents' socioeconomic circumstances were. But you can see by contrasting these two that actually from the crime survey for England and Wales, there is a lower proportion of Black people reporting that they experienced any kind of abuse as a child than there are than there are white adults reporting that they experienced some kind of abuse as a child. There's a slightly higher rate of mixed heritage adults reporting that they experienced abuse when they were a child, and there's a lower proportion of Asian respondents saying that they experienced abuse as a child compared to the white respondents. So hopefully you can already see that that is quite different to the kind of average rates or the average inequalities that we have in children looked after rates. There's some similarities, but there's some quite large differences that suggest to me, and I think suggest to us, that this is something where there are very large systemic factors and other factors that aren't just associated with you know, how the discussion around cultural differences. Black people were about 1.23 times less likely to report experiencing any types of abuse in childhood in the crime survey for England and Wales. But Black children are about 1.36 times more likely to be living in care. So those are totally at odds with each other. Mixed heritage people in the crime survey were about 1.46 times more likely to report that they experienced any kind of abuse based on those categories that are there, which might not be the best categories to measure it if you're comparing it to children looked after rates, of course, but as a broad brush sort of comparison. But mixed heritage children are about 1.55 times more likely to be living in care. So the intervention is over and above what might be suggested by the exposure to abuse and neglect. And Asian people were about 1.9 times less likely to report experiencing any types of abuse, but they're about 2.9 times less likely to be living in care. So there's quite a big difference still in terms of underrepresentation when it comes to child welfare interventions in Asian child populations. So they are less likely to report experiencing abuse, but also, but they're even less likely than that, or disproportionately less likely than that, to be living in care. So that means that there's still really, really important questions coming out of this, I think, and things to keep in mind. So I would argue that means this is a systems and service sides, or there's a lot of systems and service side phenomenon, at least, that we certainly can't explain by different exposure to abuse as children. Hopefully I've explained that well, but I'm happy to explain it more. It's a complex subject, and I'm happy also to share the paper where we sort of discuss that in a bit more detail as well. So to go through the consequences very quickly, failing to develop the kind of infrastructure to identify and recognize these intersectional inequalities might risk actually exacerbating ethnic and socioeconomic inequalities, even when there are sort of deliberate actions towards anti-racist policy and practice and anti-poverty or poverty-proofed approaches. So if you adopt a sort of poverty-proof approach without taking into account that intersectional aspect, you might risk not actually affecting sort of ethnic inequalities within that level of complexity than you might if you had taken that into account. As I mentioned briefly, the data to conduct intersectional analyses is really poor because we're having to aggregate things up to the group level, and that really limits how complex we can make the intersection. So a real truly intersectional analysis should be looking at lots and lots of different factors like religion, nationality, age, gender, as well as ethnicity and poverty or class. And we can't really do that with the quality of data that we have. We also need a much better understanding of the mechanisms of intersectional child welfare inequalities. And I think this involves quite a lot of thinking around systemic issues outside of social work. So in our paper, we wrote quite a lot about how a lot of these intersectional inequalities are actually are actually present in a lot of cultural products, mainly media products. They're present in the law, the fact that there are protections for some groups, but there's notably not protections for sort of socioeconomic status, even though there is sort of a legislative instrument, it's not been enacted. And in education, policing, early help, health, and medicine. So a policing example might be that sort of predictive policing might target high poverty neighborhoods, but it might also target neighborhoods with high levels of people from with black communities, or something that might otherwise be quite affluent. And in culture, the example that we sort of use is the idea of Vicky Pollard to talk about the sort of over intervention rates with mixed heritage children, and the fact that just sort of 15 years ago, I think it was 15 years ago, you might also have a bit of a sort of shock at how long ago that was, but it was about 15 years ago that it was pretty normalized that kids in the playground were talking about Little Britain and laughing at Vicky Pollard, and one of the punchlines in the show was the fact that she had, you know, an eight-seater pram, and the joke was that all of the kids in the pram had different skin color, and we forget, I think, sometimes how normal that was and how widespread that was. But we have a lot of these sort of intersectional cultural artifacts that are very, very sort of vindictive towards interracial relationships and white mothers on you know, housing estates. That was very, very common. And in terms of 3 things we can do that right now that might be helpful, these are sort of more long-term possibly strategies, is I think we can start to normalize our understanding of these intersectional disproportionalities. So starting to think about this more regularly and building up that sort of complex lens, I think that would be helpful. Obviously, our study just looked at one representative sample, but there's work that should be done, or I think should be done, to look at whether these intersectional inequalities apply locally. So this is all from local authority administrative data and publicly published data. So the data is there for individual local authorities or for other governments to look at this and to think about what steps might need to be taken to achieve this. And I'm more than happy to have discussions with anyone who wants to do that. And we can also map out what these intersectional inequalities are likely to look like, even if we haven't done the analysis at the locality. So you can use that table, and I'm going to plug the Child Welfare Inequalities Project app, which if you just search CWIP app, it should come up. And you can do that thing of breaking down deprivation into low, middle, and high. And I believe you can do it for Wales as well. I'm pretty sure. I'm 99% sure you can do it for Welsh local authorities. And you can sort of use those tables to map on what the disproportionality might look like as a sort of very early stage strategic conversation that you might want to have if you feel like this kind of work is valuable. And that's the last slide. There's some references here. Please do contact me if there's anything I can forward you. And I'll stop sharing my screen and turn my camera on if there's any Q&A. And hopefully people found that helpful and interesting and not too statistical.
I think you did a tremendous job of communicating what I mean, there's some very sophisticated analysis behind that, and you did a really good job of making it understandable. And I have to admit, I'm one of the people who was saying, given the sort of 3 facts you started off with, that maybe a lot of the apparent racial inequalities are largely due to deprivation. And this work has really made me realize it's not just about deprivation. Deprivation is part of the picture, that it's much more complicated than that. We have some really good questions coming in, and I would encourage anyone else who's got a question to pop one into the chat, because you know, it's not often you get a chance to ask someone who's done such interesting work directly questions about its implications. But to start us off, Xin-Yi Chung has got a couple of really good questions. One is about whether you've been able to analyze the data in relation to gender. So are there differences between boys and girls? Is that something you've been able to look at?
We attempted it using this sort of aggregate method that we were using, this sort of ecological method. But the difficulty came with that it became so difficult to interpret that we had to take a step back. And also it's sort of, it's more of a technical point, but it made the model less appropriate for sort of estimating the data because it increases the number of zero populations, because once you start, so we actually, when we started, we looked at gender, age, ethnicity, and deprivation, which was quite ambitious. But we quickly discovered that the method sort of couldn't quite stretch to that level of complexity. We needed individual child level data. But what we did get from the descriptive statistics of looking at that were that there were some differences in gender, but the big differences came out when you looked at the intersection of gender and age. So, for instance, rates for Black African 16 to 17-year-olds were very different for boys than they were for girls, which I'm sure people would be able to sort of link to their practice experience and sort of risk of being pulled into criminal exploitation and things. So we didn't bar a sort of very descriptive level, but there were certainly really interesting patterns there that I think hopefully push forward the argument that if we can get some really good individual level data that includes socioeconomic, so like income, say from the DWP or something, we could explore that in more depth and find out that actually the inequalities are even more complex than than these are.
Yeah, fascinating. Xin-Yi also asks about the butting against affluence hypothesis, which is the idea that high looked after children intervention rates in low deprivation areas might be because Black or other minority groups are more visible to social workers than they might be in high deprivation areas. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think, so we looked at this in one paper looking at, or in fact in the paper itself, we looked at the effect of ethnic density. So it's a sort of a rough, so we were drawing on sort of exposure theory, which dates back to a very long time in psychology, and the idea that sort of the fewer people from an ethnic minority group there were in the neighborhoods might add an additional effect to how much intervention there was. So we tried to test that. Contact hypothesis is what I'm thinking about, not exposure, sorry. And actually, we didn't find any evidence of that. There are studies in the US by Brett Drake and Hunil Kim and Melissa Johnson-Reid, which are exploring that, I think, in a bit more detail. And I think they still they didn't sort of frame it in contact theory, but I think they found some similar, so I think they still think that is a factor. We didn't find any evidence of it using the crude measure of ethnic density. We found actually the higher the ethnic density was for some groups, I think particularly it was mixed heritage and maybe Black Caribbean, there was actually a significant increase in intervention rates. So we were expecting the opposite if the sort of contact theory hypothesis was true, that if you had lower ethnic density on top of other things, you would get higher intervention. But we didn't find any evidence of that.
Right, that's interesting. So there's some other questions coming in. Lene, I shouldn't forget Lene Foster-Bennett, who asked the first question, so I should definitely ask it, which was really a concern about mixed heritage, because I think you mentioned in passing there was a lack of data surrounding this group. But yes, previously, many biracial children were categorized just as Black, and a lot of the nuance of their experience was lost in that miscategorization. I just wondered whether you wanted to take the opportunity to say a bit more about the mixed heritage group and how we might understand and research.
Absolutely. And I mean, we go quite a bit further in the paper, in our sort of literature review and discussion, and we talk about, for some reason the name's gone out of my head, Donald, you might remember the quite infamous now Liverpool study about interracial relationships. And I don't remember at Fletcher, the Fletcher report that dates back to sort of, don't know, 1930s, 1920s, something like that. And we sort of trace some of that historical literature with some of the modern literature about sort of the demonization, particularly of interracial relationships. That's been quite a common theme. And I think that's the thing that's really interesting to me, is because when you're familiar with, I think there is a massive concern about how we sort of discount mixed heritage people and children in general as sort of like this new phenomenon. But actually, when we look back historically, they've been faced with really quite incredible sort of just really horrible things from all kinds of levels of institutions and individuals. So you go back to the Fletcher reports, you see that there was a report written that claims that white women who got into relationships with black men were either prostitutes, mentally impaired. There were two more categories that she used, but they were equally sort of forced into marriage through pregnancy, and I can't remember the last one, but they were equally horrible, all of them. So we have like a really long cultural history of these kind of attitudes towards interrelational relationships and children with mixed race, mixed heritage, that I think we don't contend with maybe as much as we could. And sometimes, you know, there's reasons for that, but some of it is just because it's sort of one of those parts of history that's doesn't get pulled out into the light very often.
And also, as I think the questioner is sort of alluding to, there are so many different types of biracial heritage. There's all sorts of mixtures and backgrounds that you can be talking about.
Yes.
So as you said in your presentation, the problem is, as a category, it can cover all sorts of different things. So.
And in some ways, mixed heritage other is performing the same role that putting all of those children into the black category, which is also what they do or have done for a long time in America, the sort of one drop rule.
Yeah.
So it's sort of possibly fulfilling a similar kind of function of obscuring those experiences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We had another question about Roma and Irish travellers, and whether you had figures on that, or whether they were included, and if they were within one of the other categories, which category it was.
So we didn't combine them with any other category, but we did look descriptively at the very start. And one of the difficulties was because it's such a small population, and also because there's all kinds of other factors around sort of people might identify both as with their Roma and with their Roma traveller heritage, but they might also identify with a different kind of ethnic identity, like they might also identify as mixed race or something like that. So there's difficulties in the data with that, but we looked at what we could initially. What we found was interesting, but we didn't really have a broad enough range of local authorities that have really high populate or large populations of Roma or traveller communities. But we found a sort of U shape, actually. We found really high rates of intervention for a lot of types of intervention in the high deprived areas. So sort of very similar to the white British population. But also, I think one of the highest rates of intervention of any of the groups that we had on average in the low deprivation neighbourhoods. And then it was sort of like fairly low and average in the middle deprivation areas. So really and I'm definitely in conversations with Alison at Baswer, Alison Humes or Holmes and Dan Allen, who are doing work about this. And yeah, it's really, there's really interesting stuff there, but unfortunately we just didn't have as large a sample as we needed for such a small population.
There's time just for a couple more questions. So one's from Tanithu Wijayadasa, former colleague, who's going to ask about the ecological fallacy, which is when you think the relationships observed for groups necessarily hold for individuals, and wondered what plans you have to see whether these relationships hold out when individuals are observed.
Yep, it's a really good point, and absolutely we can't be sure. So in our paper, we've tried to be very careful to only talk about neighbourhood rates, and I've tried to be careful to do that here as well. But obviously, when people talk about rates, we instantly think about sort of the probabilities for individual children. It's just how our minds work. That's who we work with, and that's what we think about. And the hope is at some point we will be able to explore that question, but the barrier at the moment is good quality data about either deprivation or socioeconomic circumstances or income at the family level. So one of the things that Paul Bywaters, who led the Child Welfare Inequalities Project, has been saying is that that data isn't collected in the vast majority, or not as like a systematic collection that goes in the Annex A or goes to the DFE by children's services departments. So that's one really major challenge, is that data, should that data start being collected, or should there be better linkage between, say, the DWP data and children's services data, and what research can we do on that? And the other really major difficulty is it's very hard to get a picture at the child level for children that aren't known to children's services in some way, or aren't already or aren't in school. So you limit your analysis immediately to between 5 and 15-year-olds if you want to create a baseline of children that aren't already involved in the child protection or in children's services in some way. So that's a massive barrier, because some of the highest intervention rates are young children younger than 5 and children older than 15. So there's those two major barriers, but there is work being done. So Ruth Gilbert at Goldsmiths, I want to say.
UCL, yeah.
UCL. Ruth Gilbert is looking at whether we can have sort of data linkage across the NHS spine, which would capture a lot more children at the individual level. So absolutely, there's a risk of ecological fallacy, and I think just the scale of the kind of patterns that we're finding are a fairly strong justification that that it would be worth pursuing something more complex.
And we have 1 minute left. So a 1 minute answer to a very difficult question, which is a lot of the people here will be practitioners or managers not doing the research, but actually sort of dealing with these issues on a day-to-day level. If there was sort of one takeaway for them from your work, what do you think it would be?
That is a difficult question.
In 1 minute.
I don't want to do the usual researcher thing of saying, oh, well, we still don't know enough and we need to know more. However, we need to, but it is one of those cases where I think that is genuinely the message. I think there's enough here, and hopefully enough that is accessible to people and that I can send to people, that we can sort of ring some alarm bells and start thinking seriously about how we need to take this intersectional lens forwards. But equally, I don't want to understate the limitations that we have. And the first step I hope that people will take away is that we need some kind of push when it comes to data and analysis, and some kind of also, institutional commitments be that from government or be that from local authorities, that, okay, if you look into this, we will come up with some kind of strategy and some kind of action. We're not just going to do the research and then leave it. Yeah. That's my together answer.
Fresh. Sorry about that. Well, I mean, the one thing I would say is that we don't know enough, but we need to be trying to make sure our systems are not compounding these issues. So it does mean
absolutely
thinking about issues of deprivation and racism, and whether we're responding to them as sensitively and thoughtfully as we can. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation. Really interesting, Cal. We've had a few people asking for more, whether they can get hold of articles and things. And what we will do is we'll find out what stuff is available, talk to you, and then we'll publicize everything that you can get a hold of. And I think a lot of it is open access or on the web.
And my email's gone in the chat, so people can just, if they want to email me directly, I am allowed to send the paper, the published version of the paper, as long as I am asked over email and it's not shared beyond the person I replied to. So that is the publisher's wonderful policy.
It's ridiculous, isn't it? Well, thank you so much, Callum. That was brilliant. And thank you everyone for attending. And I hope you all have a lovely lunch break. So
thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming and listening.
Brilliant. Goodbye, everyone.